He threw divorce papers at me during his company's board meeting, calling me a gold digger in front of everyone. 3 months later, when he saw my baby bump at the grocery store, his face went white. This billionaire just realized he'd thrown away his only heir and me. If you've ever felt underestimated or thrown away by someone who should have valued you, this story will hit different. Make sure you're subscribed because stories like this remind us that sometimes karma has the most beautiful timing. Let's dive in. You know how they say love is blind? Well, mine wasn't just blind. It was straight up delusional. I'm talking about the kind of love that makes you ignore red flags the size of billboards because you're too busy being swept off your feet by private jets and 5-star restaurants. My name is Ava and I used to be married to Robert Sterling. Yes, that Robert Sterling, the tech mogul whose face graces magazine covers and whose company everyone knows. But this isn't a fairy tale, even though it started like one. I met Robert at a charity gala 3 years ago. I was there representing the non-profit where I worked trying to secure funding for our literacy programs. I had my MBA from Colombia, spoke 3 languages, and had built my career from nothing. But when Robert walked up to me at that fundraiser, all of that seemed to fade into background noise. "You're the most intelligent woman in this room," he said, not even bothering with small talk. And trust me, I've talked to everyone. That confidence, that direct approach, it was intoxicating. Here was this powerful man worth billions. And he was looking at me like I was the only person who mattered. The courtship was like something out of a movie. Weekend trips to Paris, front row seats at Broadway shows, dinners at restaurants where you needed connections just to get on the waiting list. But what drew me in wasn't the money. It was how he seemed to see me, really see me. When I talked about my work, my dreams, my thoughts on everything from social justice to business strategy, he listened like my words were precious. The wedding was spectacular. 300 guests, a designer dress that cost more than most people's cars, and enough flowers to fill a small forest. His family was there. Old money, the kind of people who trace their lineage back to the Mayflower. My family was there, too. My mom who cleaned houses to put me through college. My dad who worked double shifts at the factory. My siblings who'd never seen anything like this level of wealth. I should have paid more attention to how his family looked at mine. How they smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. How they asked my mom what she did with that particular tone that made it clear they already knew and didn't approve. How they kept referring to me as Robert's little project when they thought I couldn't hear. But I was in love, and love makes you stupid sometimes. The first year of marriage was good. Great. Even Robert was attentive, generous, and seemed genuinely proud to have me by his side. He'd introduce me at business events, highlighting my education and achievements. "This is my wife, Ava," he'd say. "She's brilliant. Has an MBA from Colombia and runs the most successful literacy program in the state." But somewhere around year 2, things started shifting. It was subtle at first, the way he'd suggest I might be more comfortable staying home when certain clients were coming to dinner. How he'd buy me jewelry after I'd express interest in taking on more responsibility at work. How he'd redirect conversations when I bring up my career goals. "You don't need to work so hard anymore, baby," he'd say, pulling me close. "You're married to me now. Let me take care of you." It sounded romantic, but it felt like a cage wrapped in silk. The real problem started when his company began facing a hostile takeover. Robert became distant, stressed, working 18-hour days. Our conversations turned into brief exchanges about schedules and social obligations. The man who used to ask about my thoughts on everything suddenly seemed to have no interest in what I had to say about anything. That's when Madison entered the picture. Madison was everything I wasn't. Blonde, 25, and from the same social circle as Robert's family. Her father owned a string of country clubs. Her mother chaired the boards of 3 different charities. And she had that effortless way of belonging in spaces where I still felt like I was performing. I first noticed her at a company Christmas party. The way Robert's eyes lingered on her when she laughed. How he made sure to include her in conversations, asking her opinion on business matters. He'd stopped discussing with me. How his family seemed to light up around her in a way they never had around me. The signs were all there, but I told myself I was being paranoid, insecure, jealous, all the things that Robert started calling me when I bring up my concerns. Madison is just a family friend, he'd say. That patient tone people use when they're talking to someone they think is being unreasonable. Her family and mine have known each other for decades. You're reading too much into nothing. But nothing doesn't leave lipstick on collar. Nothing doesn't result in charges for hotel rooms. When your husband claims to be working late. Nothing doesn't mean jewelry purchases from Tiffany when you haven't received a gift in months. When I finally confronted him with the evidence, hotel receipts, credit card statements, photos of them together that I'd found on his phone, Robert didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "You're being dramatic," he said, straightening his tie like we were discussing the weather. "Madison and I are just friends. If you can't handle the social requirements of being married to someone like me, maybe you should think about whether this marriage is really for you." The gaslighting was masterful. He made me feel like I was losing my mind. Like my concerns were proof of my inadequacy rather than his betrayal. Like I was the problem for noticing that my husband was cheating on me. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags and walked away with whatever dignity I had left. But I loved him. And I kept thinking about the man who'd swept me off my feet at that charity gala. I kept hoping he'd come back to me. Instead, he came for me. It was a Thursday morning in March when my world completely fell apart. I decided to surprise Robert with lunch at his office. His favorite sandwiches from the deli downtown and homemade cookies. I thought maybe if I could just remind him of who we used to be, we could find our way back to each other. I walked into that board meeting with a smile on my face and love in my heart. 15 of his top executives were sitting around that massive mahogany table, including Madison, who was apparently consulting on the company's strategic partnerships. "Now, perfect timing," Robert said when he saw me, but his voice was cold. Professional. Nothing like the warm tone I'd been hoping for. "Everyone, I have an announcement to make." I stood there holding that bag of sandwiches, thinking he was going to say something sweet. Maybe announce a vacation we were taking or praise something I'd done. I was so naive. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, sliding a manila envelope across the table toward me. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours regarding the prenup." The room went silent. 15 people stared at me while my world crumbled in real time. But Robert wasn't done. "I want everyone to understand that this marriage was a mistake from the beginning," he continued, his voice carrying that confident tone I'd once found so attractive. "I was manipulated by someone who saw an opportunity and took it. I won't be taken advantage of by a gold digger any longer." Gold digger in front of his entire executive team, in front of Madison, who was sitting there with barely concealed satisfaction. In front of people I'd shared meals with. People I'd considered friends. I don't remember much about what happened next. Security escorted me out. Apparently, Robert had arranged for that, too. The media was already there. Cameras flashing as I stumbled to my car, still holding that bag of sandwiches that would never be eaten. The story hit the news within hours. Tech billionaire dumps wife in boardroom drama. The articles painted me exactly as Robert intended, as an opportunistic woman who'd married for money and was now being cast aside when he'd grown tired of me. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanting statements, lawyers wanting meetings, friends wanting explanations I didn't have. The prenup I'd signed was airtight. I'd get a small settlement, enough to live modestly for a few years if I was careful, but nothing like the life I'd been living. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the isolation. People I'd considered friends stopped returning my calls. Invitations to events dried up. The charitable organizations I'd worked with suddenly found reasons why my services were no longer needed. Robert's family, who'd never fully accepted me anyway, acted like I'd never existed. Even some of my own family seemed confused about whose side they should be on. "Maybe you should try to work it out," my aunt said during one particularly painful phone call. "He's a good provider, Ava. Marriage isn't always about love." But my mom, bless her heart, saw right through it all. Baby, she said. A man who would humiliate you like that in front of all those people never loved you the way you deserve to be loved. You're worth more than that. Still, the depression hit hard. I spent weeks barely leaving my new tiny apartment, scrolling through news articles about Robert and Madison's blossoming romance. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Pictures of them at restaurants, charity events, business conferences, the same events where I used to stand by his side. It took me 3 months to start putting my life back together. 3 months of therapy, of crying, of eating ice cream for dinner, and watching romantic comedies that made me feel worse about everything. But slowly, with the help of a therapist who didn't let me wallow in self-pity, I started to remember who I was before Robert Sterling. I was Ava Johnson, MBA from Columbia, literacy advocate, daughter of 2 people who'd worked their entire lives to give their children better opportunities. I was smart, capable, and valuable. Not because of who I'd married, but because of who I'd always been. I started job hunting, which was harder than I'd expected. My association with Robert opened some doors, but it closed others. Some organizations worried about the media attention. Others seemed to think I was damaged goods. But eventually, I found a position with a non-profit focused on educational equity, work that mattered, work that fed my soul in ways that planning charity galas never had. The job paid a fraction of what I'd been used to, but it gave me something I'd lost during my marriage: purpose. I was helping kids who looked like me get access to quality education. I was writing grants, developing programs, making a real difference. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. That's when I discovered I was pregnant. I'd been feeling tired, nauseous, different for a few weeks before I finally took the test. When those 2 pink lines appeared, I sat on my bathroom floor and cried. Not because I was sad, but because everything suddenly became so much more complicated. The timing was impossible. I was just getting my life back together, just starting to feel strong again. But as I sat there staring at that positive test, I realized something. This baby was mine. Not Robert's, not anyone else's. Mine. And for the first time since that horrible day in the boardroom, I felt genuinely happy about something. I decided not to tell Robert what was the point. He'd made it clear that I was nothing to him, an embarrassment to be discarded. He was living his new life with Madison, probably planning their own wedding. My pregnancy would just be another complication he didn't want to deal with. So, I kept it to myself. I worked. I prepared. I built a support system of real friends who loved me for who I was, not who I was married to. My mom moved in to help. My sister threw me a baby shower in her backyard with folding chairs and homemade cake, and it was more meaningful than any fancy event I'd attended as Mrs. Sterling. I was 6 months pregnant when I ran into Robert at the grocery store. I was in the produce section trying to decide between organic and regular apples when I heard that familiar voice behind me. Ava. I turned around and there he was, Robert, looking exactly the same, standing next to Madison, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. For a moment, we all just stared at each other. This weird triangle of past and present. Then Robert's eyes dropped to my belly, clearly visible under my maternity dress, and his face went completely white. Is that he started, then stopped, his brain clearly trying to do the math. Congratulations, Madison said, but her voice was tight. She knew what Robert was thinking, what we were all thinking. When? Robert managed to ask. February, I said simply. It was October now, which meant I was due in just a few months, which meant I'd gotten pregnant right around the time of our divorce, which meant this baby was his. The look on Robert's face was something I'll never forget. Shock, panic, calculation. I could practically see his mind racing through all the implications. Madison looked like she was going to be sick. We need to talk, Robert said. But I was already walking away. No, we don't. I called over my shoulder, have a good day. That was the beginning of the phone calls. Robert started calling constantly, demanding paternity tests, threatening legal action, making promises he'd never kept during our marriage. His lawyers sent letters. His family, who'd pretended I didn't exist for months, suddenly wanted to reconcile, but I held firm. This baby was mine. I was financially stable, emotionally healthy, and surrounded by people who actually loved me. Robert had made his choice when he threw those divorce papers at me in front of his entire board. He'd chosen his reputation over our marriage. Madison over me, his pride over love. Now he wanted back in because suddenly I had something he needed. See, what I'd learned during the divorce proceedings was something Robert had tried to keep quiet. His inheritance from the Sterling family trust was tied to having a legitimate heir. Old money families have old rules, and the Sterling fortune, worth hundreds of millions, could only pass to someone who had biological children within wedlock. Robert and Madison weren't married. They weren't even engaged, as far as I knew, and my baby, conceived during our marriage, would be his only legitimate child. The irony was beautiful. The man who'd called me a gold digger, who'd humiliated me for allegedly wanting his money, now needed me and my child more than I'd ever needed him. When my son was born, a healthy, beautiful boy I named Isaiah, Robert was waiting in the hospital lobby. I hadn't told him I was in labor, but apparently he'd had someone watching me. The level of surveillance was disturbing, but I was too exhausted and happy to care in that moment. "I want to see him," Robert said when I was settled in my room. Isaiah, sleeping peacefully in my arms. "Why?" I asked. It wasn't cruel. I genuinely wanted to know. "Because he's my son." "No," I said, looking down at Isaiah's perfect little face. "He's my son. You made your feelings about our family very clear 9 months ago." The legal battle was intense, but brief. Robert had resources, but I had something better. The truth, a good lawyer who worked pro bono for women in situations like mine. And a prenup that actually worked in my favor for once. The same document that had limited my divorce settlement also established that any children born during the marriage were Robert's responsibility. We settled out of court. Isaiah would be provided for college fund, trust fund, the works. Robert would have supervised visitation rights, but only when I deemed it appropriate. Most importantly, I maintained primary custody and full decision-making authority over my son's upbringing. Robert's relationship with Madison didn't survive the revelation that he had a child with his ex-wife. Turns out fair-weather girlfriends don't stick around when the situation gets complicated. She was gone within weeks of Isaiah's birth. Probably off to find another billionaire with less baggage. As for me, I bought a house, nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom home in a good neighborhood with excellent schools. I continued my work with a non-profit, eventually becoming director of programs. I started dating again, taking my time to find someone who valued me for who I was, not what I represented. Robert sends child support like clockwork and sees Isaiah every other weekend. He's a decent father. I'll give him that. Though he still doesn't really understand what he lost when he threw me away. He treats our interactions like business transactions. Polite but distant. Sometimes I catch him looking at me during pickups and drop-offs. And I wonder if he ever thinks about what might have been different if he'd chosen differently. If he'd valued our marriage over his reputation, chosen love over image, picked the woman who stood by him over the one who looked good on his arm. But mostly, I don't think about Robert at all anymore. I'm too busy living my life, raising my son, doing work that matters. I'm too busy being happy. The woman who walked into the boardroom with sandwiches and hope feels like a different person now. She was looking for validation from someone who was never capable of truly seeing her worth. The woman I am now knows that my value isn't determined by how others treat me. It's inherent, unchangeable, mine. Sometimes the people who throw us away don't realize our worth until it's too late. This story reminds us that our value isn't determined by how others treat us. If this resonated with you, hit that like button and share your thoughts below. Have you ever had someone underestimate you only to regret it later? Subscribe for more stories about resilience, justice, and knowing your worth. Remember, your story isn't over. Sometimes the best chapters come after the worst betrayals.